All right, well, welcome to the Business in Calgary podcast. This is Tia Calloway and Oliver Basner, your hosts here. And today we have the opportunity to speak to Hilary Foulkes. She is featured on the March issue of the Business in Calgary magazine. And the reason you're featured is because you have been nominated by the Calgary Influential Women in Business, the Lifetime Achievement Award winner, which is absolutely amazing.
Congratulations.
So congratulations.
Well, thank you. My heart goes a little pitter-patter when you say that.
Yeah, just, what a wonderful achievement to begin with, and then to be recognized by women in business for that achievement. I mean, that's got to feel amazing all in itself right there.
Well, it certainly does. It also is a little bit intimidating.
Fair.
I think anybody that has a modicum of imposter syndrome thinks, oh my God, this is not right. And then, really being able to sit back and recognize that people have actually nominated you for this.
Yeah.
And I know myself from having done that with others, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so, the gratitude for being recognized by people that I have so much respect for,
Yeah.
Colleagues, friends,
Yeah.
that part I think took a moment to sink in, and that's where the really profound,
Yeah.
as I say, gratitude
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
resides.
100%.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned imposter syndrome, because I was in a room with a bunch of executives and senior vice presidents, vice presidents, CEOs, and one of the questions I asked is, because again, one of them was struggling with imposter syndrome, and I said, anybody in this room ever suffered from imposter syndrome? Put up your hand. And of course, 100% of the hands went up. We all suffer from it, right? And so whether you're early in your career or you're more seasoned in your career, it comes up, and we have to realize it's part of being human. Right? And it's normal.
It is, yeah. And sometimes I actually wonder if it's a way of hiding a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, kind of the low expectations, but
Yeah.
high delivery.
Yeah.
I wonder whether sometimes we don't do that to ourselves a little bit.
A little bit of that safety zone that we keep for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your early career. I want to get back to the early career. I mean, it's just amazing to me, right? As I was reading a little bit about your background, and started as a geologist back when there weren't a lot of women geologists. You were probably one of the only ones in your graduating class, if not the only one. True?
Yes, that is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of lonely, and I don't think I really thought about it very much, though. Like it was just, one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
I was doing something I liked. I really enjoyed the science. And, it wasn't really until I started going for job interviews, actually looking for a job,
Yeah.
where I realized that we weren't, from a business and society perspective, quite at the point where it was easy to move into something that was largely in remote areas, because that's where geologists went to work in that day
Right.
Yeah.
and age.
Yeah.
You started in the bush, right? So
started
tell
in
us
the
about
bush.
that.
And you hoped that someday you could get out of the bush.
What was that experience like? I mean, and men weren't as accepting back then of women in the workforce, and and I remember reading the article. You even dealt with the pinup posters on the rigs, and there's all kinds of stuff that was going on that is just absolutely not acceptable anymore. So how was that? That would have been fairly difficult, I'm guessing.
I think, I was 22 when I started.
Yeah.
And some of it was a little bit maybe of bravado, thinking, okay, I can do this. And then the reality of that dynamic set in. The fact that, people, first of all, didn't think you could do the job.
Right.
Then there was dealing with the dynamics of very diverse group of people in a very confined space, but also very isolated. And so having to actually think about your own personal safety and realizing that your behavior was going to set the standard.
Right.
And that it worked, that speaking to people with respect, that they went from being unshaven to shaven, I mean,
Right.
something as simple
Right.
as that.
Yeah.
We actually built a shower when I showed up. And, it was like, metal barrels and on a little lean-to.
Yeah.
We had a heater. That
Yeah.
hadn't happened
Right.
until
Yeah.
I showed up. And I don't remember saying, let's build a shower. It was all of a sudden it was happening. Now, I quickly learned that when they had the men and the women's sign on the shower, to keep it turned to the men so that nobody knew you were in the
yeah.
shower. So that was a trick I
Oh,
learned.
interesting.
And so,
Yeah.
there were some things for navigating.
Survival, right?
Survival.
Yeah.
Navigating,
Yeah.
survival,
Yeah.
And I kept my emotions and the struggle to myself. There was no question. There was nobody to share that
Right.
with. At the time, it
Yeah.
was, you didn't want to show any vulnerability
Right.
or any weakness.
Yeah.
If I had to have a little cry, it was into my pillow at night so
Right.
that
Right.
nobody could hear me.
Yeah.
Right? It was.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discipline, I think, that actually came to bear just dealing with, the guy that had his ear bitten off in a barroom fight. Like,
Wow.
and then the opposite, this gentleman from Holland who was extremely well read and, introduced me to novelists that I had not actually been
Yeah.
exposed to.
Yeah.
So kind of crazy, right? Just,
Different
So-
dynamic altogether.
And I'm guessing resilience would have been something that you would have had to learn pretty quickly at a young age then, at that 22 years old, how to be resilient and how to put up with some of that, the rough and gruff or whatever was going on around you.
yeah, I think that resilience is something that kind of keeps coming up in modern conversation. So I talk about that as ancient conversations, but in modern conversations, resilience is something that we are talking a lot about in business. Resilient businesses, resilient people in businesses, and I feel as if that foundation, whether it was there or not before I got to that
Right.
physical location, I suspect it was. I suspect that came from, kind of family and foundational experiences. But it certainly was a factor that helped with the success that I had in that role. And I
Right.
do consider that successful because
Yeah.
I didn't get, kind of taken away.
Yeah.
I didn't get, into any trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
That was the first time that this company had hired women in
Yeah.
the bush, and that continued on. And there was a danger that if it
Yes.
hadn't worked out with me, it was going to be years before the company would try that again.
Right. Yeah.
So there was some pressure that I felt even at that stage that it had to work. I
Right.
had to make this work.
Yeah. Of
So you
course.
really did, sort of set the stage or start that journey for other women behind you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in terms of working in those environments, absolutely.
Yeah.
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 It was early days. It was, kind of, it was before there was any real interest. It's just starting to happen. Oh, maybe we should have a more normal work environment
Right.
for
Right.
people.
Right.
'Cause
Yeah.
that's really what it boils
Yep.
down to.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like any kind of isolated, either, gender or gender identity, like you really want it to be a community of people.
Of course.
And so bringing that into a really remote area was actually quite virtuous.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like jumping into something like that where it's unknown and where you're kind of really just having to learn as you go, right? There's no handbook on how to do this because like you said, it wasn't the norm at the time. I think that, from the outside looking in, that's really something that would have people look at it and go, okay, she can do this. She must be able to make things happen because you made that happen. Do you think that first experience that you had helped you throughout your journey in your career? Like, when people heard about it, they were like, okay, she can make this work.
That's really interesting. I don't know if I've ever thought about it with that perspective. I think what it's made me realize throughout my career is you need other people
Yeah.
to make things happen.
Right.
And so you can have an idea, But if you don't communicate that idea to others, then nothing is going to happen.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how diverse that group of people are that you're communicating with, it has to resonate. So maybe that's the thing that I don't think it was so much other people looking at that, because in the early days of your career, man, you're just like learning and trying to keep your head above water, and there's no plan. There's no strategy in any of this. It was
get the job done, do it well, and survive.
And hope there's another job that isn't in the bush at some point. Right. And so I've never really thought about it influencing in that respect, but maybe some of the tools that I learned have been more consequential.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a big takeaway from it, because you are with a group of people that by all accounts are not the normal type of people that you would have been communicating with, in your past experience. And so you really do have to learn how to adapt that communication very quickly. Right?
Well, I was a city girl. Like I grew up in Montreal, very cosmopolitan city. Now I had a real affinity for nature and the outdoors and science. And so I think, that path wasn't exactly, the cosmopolitan downtown Montreal girl. But it was quite different to be thrust into such a
from the big
place.
city into the bush.
Absolutely.
I have to ask this question because I'm really, we, here at Sonic Coaching, Tia and I have worked with male leaders, female leaders, and it is different, right? And I've always said it can be harder for women, especially since you're also usually responsible for a lot of what's going on at home. You have 3 daughters that you took time off for. And so tell us a little bit about that. So you had to take that time off. I mean, it also speaks to mindset a little bit, right? Is that, back to the resilience and the mindset behind that, because it is more work as a female leader trying to, work your way up through the corporate ladder.
Yeah, that's loaded. I would say that, I think part of the reason that it's worked for me is that I am really ordinary. I feel as if my focus on the girls when they were young, they didn't know what I did for a living until just recently.
They just figured it out.
I say that a little facetiously, and I hope that they'll laugh along with me. But that's the reality of it, right? When you are really focused on the love and the care of your family, you're doing what you're doing to support them. It's not this great ambition that I had, which is, that's why I say, this isn't, for me, this is quite a surprise that I would be honored for doing something that has just been one foot in front of the other. You get an opportunity, you know that you can figure out how to do it with the right people. And I think that is something that maybe is a little different in terms of, if I'm thinking to your question about women and men, always knowing that it wasn't going to be me alone that could do something, that I was always going to need the expertise and experience of other people, but that I could somehow find a way to bring that together. And then I think just recognizing how fortunate I was. I think about this almost every day. As a female in whatever industry, if you have the latitude to take a little time off work to take your children to the doctor and you're not punching a clock, how privileged are you?
Right.
So it's flipping it from being a burden to recognizing that it's a huge privilege to have the kind of responsibility that you have, but also the freedom that you have to do what needs to be done, and still, maybe it's work those extra hours at night or whatever it is, but you have that flexibility. And so for me, that's always been something that I think has been so critical in my career, is to be able to do, yes, it's been crazy busy, right? It was nonstop for.
Absolutely.
I don't remember, people say, oh, do you remember that song from the 90s? It's no, I remember none of the 90s. And so, you know, the resilience, yeah, maybe the drive, maybe knowing that I had to support my family. Like, I don't know what is behind all that, but it's not special. People do this all the time. I had an opportunity to do it in an environment that gave me the freedom to be involved in my family's life and in the workforce. So for me, this has just been, you know, like such a gift, really. So I take away that kind of the heavy burden part.
Right. Yeah.
And I think how amazing that I got to spend so much time with my kids. Like, they're all like very grown up. And yet still be able to be involved and influence for the better some of the things that we do in business today.
Yeah.
Back to your positive mindset.
It has a lot to do with it. And there's an expression or a turn of phrase I think I learned when I was very young. You know, when something bad happens to you, you say, why me? But if you say, why not me? There's an element of humility in that. There's a recognition of the randomness of some of the very bad things that happen to good people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it just changes your perspective to being the half full instead of the half empty.
Yeah.
And it's not that there haven't been half empty times, but you get through those fast if you can really change the way you think about your circumstances.
And that question that you're asking yourself, that's a great question. Why not me?
Yeah.
Right? Takes it out of victim mode into you're feeling a little more empowered. Okay, why not me? And I can probably deal with this.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. And again, it comes back to your support system. It's whether it's in the workplace or whether it's at home. You need to be able to garner the support and the expertise from people around you to actually make things happen, whether it's at work or home. And I don't think that there's, you know, in many ways, I think that there's this integration between work and home. But I've also always been very possessive about home, that my workplace is not my family. My family is my family.
Right.
So I have always been, and I love a lot of the people that I had an opportunity to work with, but still family is family. And so I've been very possessive about that.
It's a great that's a great piece of advice, actually. It's family is family. Because sometimes we lose track of that and we think that work is family. And it can feel like family and you can, you know, enjoy the people, work with them and spend time with them. But when you get home, that's family, right? Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. I share that same value. I fiercely protect my family time and my time with my kids. And I think as a mother who works, you have to understand that boundary or it's really easy to lose it. You know, it's really easy to miss involvement in things just organically because you get so caught up. And sometimes when it gets busy and you're looking at juggling a million things and you're like, oh my gosh, there's just so much to do. It's taking that step back to say, but there's a lot to do, which I'm grateful for, but what's the priority? You know, and the priority is my family, right?
You hit the nail on the head. Because I always, like, there's a lot of conversations that we have in business and in our personal lives around decisions that we have to make. And the dilemma that you go through when you're deciding, is it this way or is it this way? Which path do I take? You know, if you really have a priority, if you have a really purposeful and strong priority, decisions are actually much easier.
Yeah.
They're much easier to make.
Yeah.
It's when you're not sure what your priorities are that it's kind of like, well, if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will do, right?
Yeah.
But if you really have strong sense of kind of that purpose and that ranking of what's important, and you have some choice, then it's a really great situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It takes some of the pressure off, right? It takes
does.
some of the guilt away.
Absolutely.
Because we feel guilt if we think we should be doing this, but we're doing this instead.
Right.
Well, if we really believe we should be doing this, there's no guilt.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talked about in the article was that at this stage in your career, you described it as it's about service. It's about giving back. So talk to us a bit about how you're doing that and why is that so important to you?
So why I'm doing it, I think there's probably, some selfish stuff in there, in that I do think that the scars that you accumulate along the way can be turned into something that is helpful
Right.
to others.
Yeah.
So I feel like there is an obligation, almost a responsibility that I have, because there's been some, amazing experiences, pretty significant corporate influence as well as personal, that I hope would be helpful to others.
Of course.
And sometimes it might be like talking to teenagers, right? Like they're just, people aren't in the moment where they can actually embrace that kind of conversation. They haven't experienced it yet. But very often people will come back and they'll say, do you remember we talked about this? And I just didn't get it at the time.
Right.
But this just happened to me.
Right.
And I think this is what you were, this is what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things are very rewarding.
Of
So,
course.
you're doing it because, yes, you think you've got something that's going to be helpful to others. And then when you get an indication that it's actually helpful, it is very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
And navigating through a career in life is not easy.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's been important to me is not the kind of help where I'm going to get you from vice president to a senior vice president. What I think is so important is the underpinnings of that. Why do you want to do that? Do you recognize the sacrifices
Right.
that have to be made?
Yeah.
Because I am not a believer that you can have it all.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think, you can't drink from every cup. You can't travel
true.
from every place in the
No,
world.
100%.
You can't do everything.
Yeah.
So what is it that you want to do or should do or can do? And this is where I think sometimes, we have this feeling of inadequacy, right? Because, we haven't led this company or we haven't reached this pinnacle. And you reach that pinnacle, there's another one. Doesn't matter how
It's
much
true.
effort.
Absolutely.
It just keeps going on. It's like materialism in a way,
Yeah.
right? Like you'll never be satisfied if you're looking for that particular
Yeah.
spot. And that's why, one of my daughters mentioned this kind of jungle gym or this monkey bar approach to ladder climbing. So we don't talk about ladder climbing. We talk about this kind of jungle gym or these monkey bars, right?
It's a good
Where
visual.
Yeah.
You've got quite a large area and you've got multiple angles and directions that you can move.
Yeah.
And it's not up and to the right.
No. Yeah.
And so, when I speak with people about where they are and where they want to go, I think it's so important to set those priorities.
Yeah.
I think the business strategy, that's always been a big part of my corporate career, is actually business strategy, is always begin with the end in mind.
Yeah. Good advice.
What do you want to do with this company?
Yeah.
Is this going to be sustainable? Are you building this company to last forever? Are you building it to flip it and sell it?
Right.
Like, are you building it for the next generation? What
Right.
are you doing this for? And
Yeah.
what does the end look like? And so it might sound a little bit morbid, but I think that people don't think enough about their own personal strategy. And what does that end look like? What does
Yeah.
the last bit look like?
Yeah.
Who's around you?
Yeah.
Who's supporting you? Who's sharing their experiences with you?
Yeah.
So I think that that's where I feel as if this experience, this journey that I'm still on, is helpful to others, because it just tends to put things in perspective. And maybe that's the geology in me, because geology is about so much about scale, right?
Right.
Right.
Like the size of things,
Yeah.
the power of things, and so we kind of lose sight of the big picture in our life, and
Right.
we focus on the minutia
Yeah.
and how we're going to get from this point to this point and get this raise or get this,
Yeah.
instead of thinking about that whole story arc
Yeah.
of what journey we're on as a human first,
Right.
and then how does our career support that?
Yeah.
And not everybody agrees with that, just
Of
to be
course.
clear.
Yeah.
Like, not everybody agrees with that approach. to thinking about their life and their careers.
Now you mentor no less than 25 women at any given time, and so that's mind blowing to me in itself, because I know how much work that can be, and one of the things that you really firmly believe in, and you kind of touched on it here as you were speaking, was to have a strategy for yourself. So when you're mentoring those young women, is that kind of the first place you go with them, is what's their personal strategy before the work strategy?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is around, how do you want to be known?
Right.
What do you want your reputation to be? What do you want your brand to be? And why?
Right.
Is that important to you?
Yeah.
So it's kind of establishing that foundation of not just what someone is in terms of their career, but who they are as a person. And so, there's times where that's not the philosophy that somebody has, and so, it's a couple of conversations and that's enough, right?
Right.
But most people are actually quite curious about where they want to go and why they want to go there. And it's kind of like this concept of peeling the onion till you cry. You take off the first layer and then you ask yourself why, and then you take off the next layer and ask yourself why, and then the next layer and ask yourself why again, and you keep going until you get to that core that drives you. And so you learn a lot about yourself in the process.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and we see it in corporations too, is corporations spend sometimes days doing offsite retreats and strategic planning sessions and developing strategy. You've been part of those. I've been part of those. Tia's been part of those, right? And yet nobody ever says, what's your personal strategy? That's what I loved about, what you have to say there is we forget that maybe we should take a day and do an offsite retreat with ourselves or with our loved ones and our significant other and say, okay, what is our strategy going to be? What does the end look like? So I think what you're saying is absolutely brilliant, especially when somebody, it's never too late, but when somebody's, young and they haven't really thought about that. Because I don't know about you, but for me, I kind of got tossed around based on where things were showing up and, okay, I'm going to do this. Let's see how this comes together. And it sort of all worked out in the end. But, I think back now, I go, would have been interesting to actually have a strategy before I got going, right?
It's interesting you say that too, because from my perspective, people are quite dissatisfied. They always think they want more, need more, they want more recognition. And I think sometimes it's because they don't have a strategy.
Right.
Because if you have very simple, basic principles as your strategy, it's not hard. I'll take that back. It's not simple to achieve. But if it's a thing that you're after, or like something really super specific, you might be disappointed.
It's true when you get there. Yeah.
Right? But if you don't have this particular area of focus and you're just looking at, building a good life, it takes away all that pressure to be this title or this amount of income or X number of houses or, like maybe all that comes through your success along the way, but it's an outcome.
Yeah.
It's not a strategy to me. Anyway. And it's the same with, the company says they want to increase free cash flow. Well, that's an outcome of the strategy.
Yeah.
Yes. Totally agree.
Good strategy. You have the way that you execute on that strategy, and then you have your day-to-day detail around, fulfilling it. But the free cash flow is a consequence
Absolutely.
of having a really good strategy.
Yeah, and around that strategy, sometimes you have to have a little bit of fluidity and being able to adjust and adapt because the market changes, right? And things adapt, competitors adapt. So,
Well, and I think going back to what you said before, if you understand your priorities and your why, you can pivot. You can make those changes and you can go with that flow a lot easier because the why is very clear. And your priorities become very clear, right? You can keep that all in mind as you're navigating, some of those unknowns that come up and, opportunities for change. Instead of looking at it as this wasn't my plan, it's about, what is going to keep those priorities in mind. And sometimes it's not the direction you think you're going to go.
I read about this, just picking up on that, because I think that's perfect. I read this thing about, I think it was called the Golden Circle. I can't remember who did it, and maybe it was a TED Talk. But in the center is why, then I believe it's how, and then what. So your why really, from an individual perspective, should stay fairly constant.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, the how and the what are the variables. So
Yeah.
you're going down this career path because this is how you think you're going to accomplish the center, the why.
Yes.
And something happens, and you're off work for a while because you're sick, or you're whatever, right? Or you lose your job, or your industry is under pressure and you have to pivot.
Yeah.
And then the what is the day-to-day tasks.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not terribly strategic.
Yeah.
That's actually just the day-to-day tasks. So for me, here's my why, and then, how. Okay, I'm a geologist. How am I going to put that to work?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then what am I going to do? It's all those different things.
All
It's
the
working
tactical
with
things.
the guy
Yeah.
that lost his ear, and it's working, with some fantastic investment bankers and
Yeah.
some amazing, industry
Right.
leaders, and so that's the what part, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the questions, Hilary, that we ask every one of our guests is, what do you wish someone would have told you when you were starting your journey?
I haven't actually given that a whole bunch of thought, but it's a really good question, and I think it would be, don't rush. There's no panic.
Great answer.
Yeah.
There's not the urgency that sometimes I think we feel.
Yeah.
The urgency to take on something new, the urgency to try something, get something done. Like, I know in my younger life, I was like very much on a straight path of,
Right.
growing up, leaving home, going to university, getting a job, getting married, having children.
Right.
Like, this was, maybe it's the generation that I am.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it would be that. There's time. You have time. You don't have a particular deadline.
Enjoy the journey.
And it is very much about enjoy the journey. But this constant urgency is something that I think I felt. And I hope that my children don't feel that pressure, that
Right.
demand.
Yeah.
And make sure that everything is kind of fulfilling this ultimate
Yeah.
goal.
Yeah.
That's great advice, and that's not something we've heard from any of our other guests. So, thank you for sharing that.
Oh,
Absolutely. Personal development and professional development, they are one and the same. We all learn that over our lifetime, and when you develop a professional skill, it comes into, aspect in your personal life and vice versa. So we always like to ask, what has been one of your favorite, books or tools or, something that has really impacted you that you would recommend to others?
Besides the guy with the ear.
well, he didn't read, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Well, he just looked at pictures, and we'll leave it at that, because you know what pictures he was looking at. I read a lot, and I find many of the books I read, there's gems there that you just want to pick up, and then there's parts where you just flip through the
Right.
pages pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so, to point to one book, I'm going to pick a book, and I can't remember the author's name, but it's entitled Quiet.
Okay.
And it's the power of the introvert in a world that won't stop talking.
Interesting. I haven't read that one.
Susan, somebody, I can't remember her surname. And it's really helpful as a leader, as well as a family member, a community member, a group of friends. Like, this to me is applicable, what she talks about. And it's this concept of, kind of everybody is on a bit of a spectrum in terms of their introversion and their extroversion. But we misunderstand the implications of that.
Right.
And we lose capacity in our organizations by not respecting the power of the introvert. So you just think, as an example, a brainstorming session. Introverts are not going to bring their best to the table.
Right.
But give them an opportunity to think deeply, quietly about something, and the ideas will be endless.
Yeah.
So it's really, we create these environments where we believe that extroverts are, the people we should be listening to. And very often we're missing a whole
The deep
spectrum.
thinkers.
The deep thinkers.
Yeah, that are sitting there quietly thinking about things.
Yeah. We used to have this, we would expect CEOs to be like loud and aggressive and, have all the answers.
Don't show weakness.
Don't show weakness. And we've learned that there's a lot more to leadership than that particular characteristic.
Yeah.
And so you see a big change in leadership, not always globally, let's just leave it at that. But that concept of, listening more than you speak sometimes is really of value. And the book, The Quiet, and it talks about everything from, children in schools and how schools are set up to support extroverts more than introverts. And so this, a little kid hides behind you when you're trying to introduce them, and you push them out and say, say hello.
Right.
And so it just talks about some of our behaviors, and it was quite enlightening in terms of some of the decisions you can make and some of the inclusion. So it's part of being inclusive, is actually to understand that in your organization or in your family, wherever the case may be. So I would say it's one of many,
of course.
but it's the one that occurs to me.
Yeah, thank you for recommending that.
Yeah.
And the author is Susan Cain,
yes.
Cain.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's one I haven't personally read, so I'm gonna have to look that one up
neither.
myself. And so thank you for sharing that.
Sounds interesting.
Guess what? We're at the end of our time, so thank you so much for spending some time with us. I mean, there's been nuggets all throughout this last 35 minutes that we've chatted. So thank you for sharing that wisdom that you have.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
And this is the Business in Calgary magazine podcast, and we'll be back with another episode here in a couple of weeks. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.